I think what we're seeing overall in these surveys over the last 5 years is a cry for better leadership coming from the country. For 5 years in a row, we've had significant majorities of people in the country saying we have a crisis in leadership. And here at the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School, we believe that effective leadership is at the key, is the X factor in whether organizations and whether nations do well or not. So the fact we have a crisis in leadership is very disturbing. In this most recent survey, only 38% of people say that they think our leaders are doing a reasonably good job. 68% of people in this country say we have a crisis in leadership. And 71% of people in the survey say if the crisis continues, we have a lack of leadership in the future, it's going to lead to the decline of America. Clearly, the question of decline is very much on people's minds. Well, political science often finds that the evaluations of how Washington is doing depend to some degree on what your political coloration is, what lens you're looking at it through. You know, where you stand often depends on where you sit, as the old saying goes. And so, since the President Obama was elected, we see that moderates and liberals, over the 2-year time, do have more confidence in the leadership of the government. You know, at the end of the Bush years, they had very, very low confidence. They get a Democrat in office, and liberals in particular, but moderates as well, have more confidence. On the other hand, conservatives, just the opposite. You know, their confidence level was much higher in the George W. Bush years, even though still not high. But now it's really plunged in the Obama years, and I think that's to be expected. I think what's important to understand, though, is the breakout of those groups. They're not all the same size. Liberals in our survey composed about 25% of the national public, whereas conservatives were about 39% or about 40%. And the moderates were about another 35 to 40%. So what you find is that we have a president who is seen as liberal, but the proportion of people in the country who identify as liberal are quite small. I've seen other surveys, for example, that 66% of people in other surveys are identifying Barack Obama as a liberal. And I think part of his problem is, part of his political problem is, that our survey underscores, is that a lot of people who are judging him are not liberals. You know, the vast majority of people are not liberal, and they tend to be a little harder on him. I'm not quite sure how we can account for it. The confidence level in the military is the highest of all the sectors. We studied 13, 14 sectors, and it remains high, but we're bogged down in a couple of wars now. We're entering our 10th year in Afghanistan, and we've had a general fired in Afghanistan, General McChrystal. So there has been some question in the public's mind about how effective are we in fighting these wars. I don't think the military is getting as much blame as the Congress and the White House, but it's clearly taken a little bit of a nick in this year's survey. I found the emotional questions we asked and how people responded very interesting this year, and they were new questions, fresh questions. And the fact that 56% of people in this country say we have more crises in the past means Americans are pretty smart. We do have more crises than in the past. I think we're also, we're under a constant bombardment, some think, from the press, the media, saying crisis, crisis, crisis. You got a level 2 storm coming in, and it looks like the end of the world. Is sometimes the way it's portrayed. So I think we can overdo it. But the fact is, we do have some pretty severe problems facing the country now, and I think Americans are very receptive to that. But what's striking about this is how they respond emotionally. There's been an awful lot of talk in the last few months about how angry Americans are, how frustrated they are. What this poll finds is, in fact, that anger and frustration are not the predominant negative feelings, that in fact it's disappointment. And that, I think, speaks to the high levels of expectation that surrounded President Obama when he came into office. And it speaks to the high level of expectation that once we came out of the depth of the recession, that the economy would rebound. And the fact that it's been so sluggish and so slow, and the unemployment has remained, stubbornly high, above 9%, the longest period we've had in modern history above 9%, I think has led to this sense of disappointment. What's reassuring about the poll, in the midst of all of the sort of the gloom and the sense of crisis, what's reassuring, I think, is that when we ask people what their predominant positive feeling was, it was that they were hopeful. Which does suggest that we don't suffer from what was. We had a famous discussion back in the late 1970s when Jimmy Carter was president about whether we suffered from a malaise, whether we'd sort of lost our optimism about the future. And there was a famous surveys that led President Carter to give a speech that went down in history about as a malaise speech. There were surveys inside the White House at that time that showed that for the first time in history, people thought we were worse off today than we were 5 years ago, and that 5 years from now, we're going to be worse off than we are today. Always in the past, that would have been an upward slope. People thought we're better off today than we were 5 years ago, and we're going to be better off still 5 years from now. So it was when that slope reversed that Pat Caddell, the pollster for President Carter and a political strategist, persuaded President Carter to give a speech about he didn't use the word malaise, but that became the tagline for the speech. And here we're not seeing, I think, we're not seeing the malaise. We're seeing a continued sense of hope, and I think that is, I think we should draw a reassurance from that, because there is something to work with when people are still hopeful. You can still stir them, and they don't become demoralized. I think the worst thing, if you get into a downward spiral and your economy is not working, your politics are not working, you got a crisis of leadership, and then you become completely demoralized. You really can get yourself into a downward spiral. This suggests that we have a little more time to work things out. I do think we don't have much time. If there's anything we've also learned in these surveys, Americans are crying out for better leadership, but we've also come to understand that leadership is very hard. And this is a difficult environment in which to lead. The problems are severe. The answers are not easy. There's often a lot of sacrifice. Somebody has to pay. Status quo is unsustainable. We all know that. And there's a sense that the walls are closing in around us a little bit. And I also think that I feel that the country is increasingly fractured as a society, and that people don't have as much of a sense of identification with some central idea that draws us together. And I think that's also goes to the fundamentals about leadership. A leadership of a nation is about drawing people together and marching forward together. And to the extent that we're sort of dividing out, I think we're going to see. I would imagine that over the next few years we're going to continue to see a real unrest on the public part until somebody comes along that dramatically changes. You can do that. I do want to point out that while we don't have surveys to prove this, we do know that in 1931, 1932, the country was very down on its leadership. It was very, very disappointed. It was very bleak, and people thought nobody could govern anymore. And when Franklin Roosevelt arrived and gave his first inaugural address, it was such a tonic that within days, historians record that within days confidence levels were rising again, and there was real progress. And frankly, we saw that in a somewhat more modest version. We saw that with Reagan. When he came in 1981, there was a growing sense that nobody could govern. We had a series of presidents who'd been forced out of office, or had been scandal, and Watergate, and Vietnam, and all the rest. And there was this real sense that nobody could govern, and nobody could lead. And Reagan came in, and boom, within 30 days, people were saying, "We got a leader in the White House again." It makes a difference. And I think we've seen in these surveys that there was such a high level of hope and expectation when President Obama was elected. And so self-congratulation, in fact, that we'd elected our first African-American, first major industrialized nation in history to do what we did. And so there was this glow about him. And I think what we're seeing in the survey is a sense of disappointment. Things haven't changed as much as people hoped they would.